In 2002, the Hall of Fame crowned a thief. They called him Bill Carlisle, the 93-year-old clown. But as the clown took his honors, a ghost screamed in silence, the ghost of Cliff Carlisle, his brother. Cliff was the genius, Bill was the showman. And this is the tragedy. The showman lived to steal a legacy. The genius died in oblivion. To understand the war that defined their music, you must first understand the land that defined them. Kentucky at the dawn of the 20th century was not a place for dreamers. It was and is a land of extreme, violent contradiction. It is a place of staggering natural beauty, of rolling green hills and deep, misty valleys. But beneath that beauty lies a brutal reality. It is a world of abject generational poverty, a place defined by two things and two things only: the unforgiving, barren soil of the small farm and the suffocating black dust of the coal mine. This was a world that did not build character. It stripped it away, leaving you with a hardened, calloused core or nothing at all. Men died young, coughing up black lungs into a dirty rag, or they broke their backs on land that took more than it ever gave. It was a place where a single failed crop, a single mine collapse, or a single harsh winter meant the difference between survival and starvation. This was the crucible that forged the two men who would become crucial pioneers of the Yodel blues and the steel guitar, Clifford and William Carlisle. They were two sides of the same coin, struck in the same agonizing fire, but they came out bearing entirely different imprints. They were the sons of a poor, struggling family, one of 5 children. Their father was a man broken by this very land, a man who divided his life between the futile work of a tenant farmer and the soul-crushing labor of a coal miner. Their mother was the family's anchor, a devout woman who sang the old gospel ballads and held the fragile home together with faith. This family lived in a constant, churning state of internal migration, moving from one small, failing farm to another, never planting deep roots. This rootlessness, this constant instability became the psychological backdrop for both boys. It instilled in them a primal, gnawing fear of poverty, an obsession with financial security that would become the driving engine for their entire lives. But it was how they chose to fight that fear that would define their conflict. And like all great family tragedies, like all stories of sibling rivalry, the story begins with the heavy, unyielding burden of the eldest son. Clifford Raymond Carlisle was born on May 6, 1903, in Mount Eden, Kentucky. He was the firstborn. In a family living on the razor's edge of desperation, the eldest son is not a child. He is an asset. He is a future investment, another pair of hands, another body to throw into the furnace of manual labor. From the moment he could walk, Cliff was saddled with the weight of expectation. He was the serious one, the responsible one, the one who had to help his father hold back the tide of destitution. His father, a man of blunt, practical realities, had no time for frivolous dreams. He believed in real jobs. A real job was one you could measure in sweat, in calluses, in pain. It was a job that ended with you physically spent and hopefully with a few coins in your pocket. Music, in his eyes, was a dangerous luxury, a path to laziness, a frivolous distraction from the naked daily task of survival. This conflict, the practical world of the father versus the ambitious world of art, became the first and most defining war of Cliff's young life. The family's constant relocation in search of work only amplified this pressure. They moved from one cramped, primitive cabin to another, never truly belonging anywhere. This sense of rootlessness created a deep internal conflict for Cliff. He was surrounded by the rich, ancient music of the region, The gospel ballads his mother sang, the old fiddle tunes passed down in the hills. He felt the pull of this art, this ambition. But he also felt the cold, hard reality of his father's world. He saw the consequences of failure every single day in the lines on his parents' faces. He had to find a way to reconcile these two opposing forces. He had to prove to his father and perhaps to himself that his ambition was not frivolous. He had to make it practical. And so he made a decision that would shape his entire destiny. He would not just be a musician, he would be a master. He would not just play music, he would work at it with the same deadly seriousness as a man going into a mine. His art would not be a hobby, it would be his real job, a craft he would perfect until it could provide the one thing he craved: permanent financial security. This psychological decision was the seed of his entire serious blues persona. He was not a dreamer. He was a craftsman, a laborer of music. He was driven not by a simple love of melody, but by a desperate, obsessive need to justify his existence in the practical terms his father understood. This drive for mastery would make him a genius, but it would also make him rigid, unyielding, and decades later, utterly incapable of tolerating the one person who treated music as the one thing he could not. Funcliffe's first tragedy was not a single, shocking event. It was a slow, cruel erosion. It was a devil's bargain signed not in blood, but in coal dust. In 1911, at just 8 years old, young Cliff had to follow his father into the mines. This was his induction into his father's world of real work. We must stop and truly comprehend what this means, to separate it from any romantic notion of a hard-knock life. This was not a character-building after-school chore. This was brutal, dangerous, and illegal child labor in one of the most hazardous environments on earth. Long before meaningful labor laws or unions had any power in the remote hills of Kentucky, an 8-year-old boy who should be in a one-room schoolhouse or playing in a creek is instead descending deep underground. He is in a dark, cramped, suffocating tunnel, starved of sunlight for hours on end. He is breathing air that is thick with toxic coal dust, a fine black powder that lines his lungs, a debt that his body will never be able to repay. He is using his small, undeveloped hands, his growth plates still soft, to perform repetitive, back-breaking manual labor, perhaps sorting coal or leading a mule, or working in a space too small for a grown man. This was the price of survival for the Carlisle family. And that very work, the real job his father insisted upon, planted the seeds of Cliff's physical destruction, the constant penetrating dampness of the mine, the biting cold of the earth that settles into your bones, and the repetitive unnatural strain of the labor began their insidious assault on Cliff's young body. It was here, in the dark, that chronic, debilitating arthritis began to take root in the joints of his fingers, his wrists, and his hands. At the time, it was just aches and pains. It was the kind of soreness that a resilient child raised in a world where pain was a constant companion could ignore. He was tough. He was the eldest son. He had to be. But this was not fatigue. This was a disease. This was a time bomb planted in the very tools of his future trade. A bomb set by the very practical world he was so desperate to escape decades later. This curse born in the mine would return. It would come to collect its debt with catastrophic interest at the absolute peak of his fame, and it would steal the one thing that had given him his freedom. This experience did more than just damage his body. It solidified his psychology. It fused his fear of poverty with an ironclad determination he had to get out. The real job of the mines was a death sentence, a slow physical execution. His mother's world of music was no longer just an ambition. It was his only possible escape route. He poured every ounce of his focus into it, not with the joy of a child prodigy, but with the grim, desperate focus of a prisoner digging a tunnel. While his body was paying a toll in the mines, his mind was finding its weapons. Cliff was a genius, and his environment, though brutal, was musically rich. He was a sponge, absorbing everything. From his mother he inherited the ancient, haunting melodies of the Appalachian ballads and the spiritual fervor of the gospel hymns she sang. These songs gave him his sense of structure, his storytelling, his high, lonesome sound. But it was in the mining camps, in the crucible of shared labor, that he found his soul. In the segregated world of early 20th century Kentucky, the mining camps were a rare, forced point of cultural crossover. Poor white Appalachian laborers, like his father, worked side by side with poor black laborers, many of whom had migrated from the Mississippi Delta. They shared their poverty, their oppression, and their music. And it was here that young Cliff, with the preternatural ears of a master, heard the raw, unfiltered blues for the first time. This was not the polished blues of a theater. This was the guttural, rhythmic, painful sound of the work camp. This was a profound, almost secret influence. In a time and place of extreme racial taboo, admitting that your white hillbilly music was built on a black foundation was not just controversial, it was dangerous. This secret, this white Yodel black influence, became a core part of his musical DNA. It was the source of the serious, authentic feel he championed his entire life. It gave his music a depth and a grit that most of his white contemporaries lacked. This too would become a source of conflict. He began to search for an instrument that could speak this new, complex language. He started on the fiddle, the traditional instrument of the hills. By 1913, at just 10 years old, he was already a local prodigy, playing at county fairs. He reportedly made his radio debut on WHAS in Louisville around this time, a stunning achievement for a child of his background. But the fiddle was too common. It couldn't capture the mournful, sliding sound of the blues he had heard. Then he found it. It was a new, strange, and exotic instrument, filtering in from Hawaii, the steel guitar, or, as it would come to be known, the dobro. He learned to play it Hawaiian style, laying it flat on his lap, using a heavy steel bar to slide across the strings. The sound it produced was alien, liquid, and incredibly human. It could wail like a grieving woman, or it could moan like the wind in a mine shaft. It was the perfect, haunting voice for his blues. And then he found his own voice to match it. In the 1920s, a new star exploded onto the fledgling record industry, Jimmie Rodgers. Rodgers was America's blue yodeler, the first man to successfully fuse the black blues of the Delta with the white yodel of the mountains. For Cliff, this was not an influence, it was a revelation. It was the validation of everything he had been instinctively feeling. He immediately adopted the yodel, but his was different. Rodgers' yodel was often playful, a blue punctuation. Cliff's yodel was a cry of pain. It was the high, lonesome sound of a boy who had worked in a mine, a sound that perfectly matched the ghostly wail of his new steel guitar. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, he honed this craft. He became a solo recording star in his own right, one of the most recorded artists of the era for labels like ARC and Bluebird. He was a master, but nobody knew it. He was a poet, but he was forced to dig coal. He was ready to prove himself, to conquer the world, to finally achieve the financial security that would free him from the real jobs forever. He had the soul, the skill, and the ambition, but he was too serious. He lacked the one thing a star needed, an easy, crowd-pleasing charisma. Then there was the other side of the coin. William Tolliver, Bill Carlisle, was born on December 19, 1908 in Wakefield, Kentucky. He was born 5 years after Cliff, and those 5 years, in a family of 5 children, made all the difference in the world. Bill was the youngest. This is the single most important psychological detail of his life. He was not the heir, he was the afterthought. He grew up in the shadow of the serious, responsible, and increasingly talented eldest son. If Cliff, the firstborn, learned to face the family's brutal competition for resources and attention by becoming serious, responsible, and technically perfect, Bill learned the opposite lesson. As the youngest, in a cramped, primitive cabin with 4 other siblings, Bill realized that the fastest and most effective way to get noticed, to steal a moment of his parents' attention, was not to be good. It was to be loud. It was to be funny. Bill was not spared the family curse. He too was a child of poverty. He too was forced into manual labor by the age of 8, around 1916. While the mine was Cliff's cross to bear, Bill's was the farm. The back-breaking work of a tenant farmer's son, lifting and hauling, attacked his spine, planting the seeds of the chronic back pain that would plague him for his entire 94-year life. He, too, shared Cliff's visceral fear of poverty and his desperate obsession with financial security. But his reaction to this shared trauma was the polar opposite of his brother's. If Cliff saw music as a serious, somber mission, a war to prove his worth, Bill saw music as an escape. It was a joke. It was a performance. It was a way to make people laugh, and in that laughter, to find the validation and attention he craved. The same family conflict that had defined Cliff also defined Bill. The practical father also pushed him toward a real job in the mines. But Bill's ambition wasn't to be a master like Cliff. His ambition was to be an entertainer. He wanted to make people smile. He found his inspiration from the other side of their mother's talent. The same devout woman who sang the mournful gospel ballads for Cliff was also the one who organized and starred in comedic skits. At church socials and community gatherings, Cliff was drawn to the ballads. Bill, the class clown in training, was drawn to the skits. He didn't care about the haunting, complex steel guitar. He chose the standard acoustic rhythm guitar, but he played it not with a master's precision, but with a frenetic, twanged, percussive energy. His guitar wasn't meant to make you weep. It was meant to make you stomp your feet. This created the fundamental split in the family's artistic soul. Cliff was serious ambition, born of a need to prove his worth. Bill was fun ambition, born of a need to be noticed. And this difference planted the seed of a bitter, lifelong secret. Deep down, Bill was always profoundly jealous of Cliff's serious talent. In the hierarchy of art, Cliff was the real artist. He was the poet, the master of the blues, the one who could silence a room with a single, authentic, mournful note. Bill, in his own eyes, and certainly in the eyes of his older brother, was just the funny guy. He was the comic relief. He was the sideshow. This insecurity, this nagging, persistent fear that his comedy was inherently less valuable than his brother's somber blues, would become a secret toxic guilt that Bill concealed for his entire life. He hid it for the sake of their harmony, but it was always there, simmering. This deep-seated envy, this inferiority complex, would fuel his ferocious solo ambition later in life. He had to prove not just to the world, but to the ghost of his brother, that fun was just as valuable, just as real, as serious. Their early paths ran in parallel to Cliff's like his brother. Bill also made his radio debut on Waz around 1918. also at the age of 10. But he wasn't there as a serious musician. He was there as a child comedian. In the 1920s, he too played in the same rough Kentucky bars. And just like Cliff, he too had to work the same soul-crushing day jobs on the farm and in the mines. He too felt the agonizing frustration of anonymity. But his frustration was different. Cliff was angry that his skill wasn't being recognized. Bill was angry that his comedy was being dismissed as a gimmick, that he wasn't being taken seriously as an artist. They were two incomplete halves of the same story, both determined, both desperate, and both profoundly stuck. The funny man persona that Bill would later build for the Opry was not just a performance. It was a suit of armor. It was a mask, forged in the fires of childhood rivalry, to hide his deepest insecurity and his lifelong fear of never, ever being as good as his older brother. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the brothers began performing together, with Bill joining Cliff's more established act. Cliff had the virtuoso skill, the plaintive yodel, the authentic blues, and the soul of a poet. But he lacked charisma. He was too dark, too intense, too serious for a mass audience. Bill had boundless energy, clown charm, a likable sense of humor, and the ability to magnetically connect with any crowd. But he lacked artistic depth, a serious foundation. Individually, they were incomplete, but together, they were a force. They officially became the Carlisle brothers, poet and clown, bluesman and showman, fire and water, serious and funny. One of the most complex duos in music history was born. The battle for its soul and for the legacy of the Carlisle name began that very first day this pact was forged, as the world was plunging into the darkest economic abyss in modern history. The Great Depression was not a distant headline. It was a suffocating daily reality. The financial insecurity that had haunted their Kentucky childhood, the visceral fear of starvation and uprooting, had now become a global pandemic. For the brothers, their family's desperate gamble on music was no longer just about ambition or proving their father wrong. It was about survival. The real jobs in the mines and on the farms were disappearing, the smokestacks were cold, and the food lines were getting longer. Their futile dream, in a terrifying twist of fate, had become the family's only hope. This desperation forged their early sound. It's not a smooth, gentle blend like later sibling duos. It's a collision. It's the sound of their two opposing personalities squeezed into a single microphone. On one side, you have Cliff's raw, plaintive artistry. He brings a high, lonesome yodel, a sound filled with the pain of the times and the strange, pathetic sound of his Hawaiian steel guitar. On the other, you have Bill's frantic, rhythmic energy. He attacks his rhythm guitar with a twanged beat, and he brings the quick-witted, crowd-pleasing charm of a comedian. Their early act was this perfect, unstable fusion. Cliff would sing a verse of a haunting blues ballad, his steel guitar weeping, and then Bill would jump in with a manic yodel or a high-energy guitar break, shattering the mood. It was disorienting, exciting, and absolutely unique. They were a local phenomenon, a big fish in the small, muddy pond of Kentucky and Ohio radio. They perfected their craft on broadcasts for WHAS in Louisville, their voices crackling across the airwaves to families who were just as desperate as they were. They were an escape, but they were also an affirmation of the struggle. They played for pennies at dusty county fairs, in rough and tumble honky-tonks, and at any barn dance that would have them. The pressure was immense. Every performance was an audition for their next meal. This environment only hardened their childhood personas. Cliff, as the eldest and the poet, became the duo's reluctant, serious leader. He was driven, focused, and obsessed with the technical perfection he believed would be their salvation. He was fighting his fear of poverty with his mastery. Bill the Jester channeled his own anxiety into his performance. He was the showman, the one who had to win over the crowd every single night. He was fighting his fear of poverty with sheer, relentless charisma. This was the core of their dynamic. Cliff was the soul, but Bill was the heart. And from the very beginning, they were pulling in opposite directions, held together only by the terrifying prospect of failure. Their family harmony model was their only lifeboat to escape the mines, and they were both clinging to it for dear life. Even as they chased this unstable dream, the psychological ghosts of their childhood, the poverty, the constant migration, the feeling of rootlessness, demanded a heavy price. Both men were haunted by the instability of their past. Their professional lives were a constant gamble, a life lived in cars, in cheap boarding houses. As a result, both brothers, in their own way, became obsessed with building the one thing they had never known, a permanent, stable home. They desperately needed to build personal fortresses to protect themselves from the chaos of their chosen career. Cliff, the serious, responsible older brother, was the first to build his fortress. In 1933, at the age of 30, he married Bertha. This was not a fleeting showbiz romance. It was an act of profound anchoring. Bertha was a stable, grounding presence, a woman who understood the hardship of the Kentucky life. Their marriage, which would last until his death, became Cliff's personal sanctuary. It was the one place where the poet didn't have to perform, the one place where his financial anxieties were quieted by the reality of a home he could call his own. Bill, watching his brother create this anchor, soon followed suit. In 1936, he married Leona. Like Cliff's marriage, this was a rock-solid union that would also last a lifetime, until her death in 1999. These marriages were not just personal milestones. They were crucial strategic moves in their war against poverty. They were declarations of permanence. The two boys who had been shuffled from one cramped cabin to another had now as men built the foundations of their own dynasties. This stability at home, however, only amplified the conflict on the road. Now, they weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for their wives and their new families. The pressure to succeed, to make the gamble pay off, was quadrupled. Their father's skeptical voice still echoed in their ears, his warnings about the instability of touring, now more potent than ever. Every failed gig, every thin crowd, was not just a professional setback, it was a personal failure, a confirmation of their father's worst fears. This pressure to provide, to build a wall of security around their new families, made them desperate for the next level they needed to get out of the Kentucky-Ohio circuit. They needed a record deal. In the mid-1930s, the break they had been bleeding for finally came. They were recording for labels like ARC and later Decca. This was it. This was the escape from the coal mines, the ticket to financial security, the validation of their entire lives. This was the moment they could finally prove to their father that music was, in fact, a real job. And it was, ironically, the exact moment their private, creative war became a public, professional, and unwinnable conflict. The recording studio was not a sanctuary. It became their official battleground, and they quickly discovered that there was a third combatant in this war, one they hadn't anticipated. The label, the executives were businessmen, not artists. They were not interested in Cliff's serious blues artistry or the cultural authenticity of his Yodel. They were interested in one thing and one thing only: jukebox sales. They needed songs that would make a listener in a noisy bar put another nickel in the slot. And in the very first sessions, the label executives made their choice clear. They heard Cliff's somber, complex steel guitar ballads, and they heard Bill's frantic, funny, and often risque novelty songs. It was no contest. They immediately and overwhelmingly sided with Bill. His fun sound was commercial. It was catchy, it was danceable, and it was simple. It was the perfect, profitable formula for the Depression-era audience that wanted 3 minutes of escape, not 3 minutes of art. This decision had a profound and immediate psychological impact on both brothers. For Bill, it was a massive life-changing validation. The funny guy, the jester, the man who had secretly, his entire life, felt inferior to his brother's real talent, was now being told by the most powerful men in the industry that he was the commercial engine. He was the one who sold records. This emboldened him, giving him a new power and leverage within the duo. His secret jealousy was momentarily quieted by this external success, but it also created a new, deeper, and more arrogant rift. For Cliff, it was a stinging, profound betrayal. It was the ultimate, humiliating insult. He was the master, the poet, the innovator, the one with the skill. And here he was in a professional studio, being treated as a sideman for his younger brother's comedy act. It was his father's practicality all over again, but in a new corporate form. The real job of digging coal had been replaced by the real job of selling records, and both, it seemed, required him to sacrifice his soul. The executives were telling him in no uncertain terms that his serious art was unprofitable. This set the stage for the next most crucial phase of their career. The studio became a pressure cooker of resentment, fights over song selection, over arrangements, over who would take the lead vocal, became commonplace. Cliff, the proud master, was forced to play on, and even sing on, songs he despised, songs he felt were beneath his artistry. Bill, newly confident, pushed for more of his material, seeing his brother's artistic integrity as stubborn, old-fashioned, and worst of all, a threat to their financial security. The recording output of the Carlisle brothers during the late 1930s and early 1940s is a perfect, schizophrenic snapshot of this internal war. Their catalog is a dizzying, contradictory mix of the sublime and the ridiculous, often on the same record. One side would be a Cliff song, a deep, haunting blues ballad like Blue Dreams or Weary Heart, featuring his complex, mournful steel guitar work and his authentic, sorrowful yodel. These were tracks of pure, unadulterated artistry, songs that would later be studied by music historians as foundational texts of country blues. Then the B-side or the very next single would be a Bill song, a frantic, fast-paced novelty tune, often with a title that was a barely disguised double entendre. Songs like Sal, Gotta Meat Skin, or Shake That Little Thing were Bill's specialty. Driven by his relentless rhythm guitar and his half-spoken, half-sung comedic delivery. They were simple, they were catchy, and they were, to Cliff's horror, extremely popular in the honky-tonks and on the jukeboxes. The label, seeing the sales, demanded more. This very tension, this violent push and pull between the somber and the silly, is what accidentally created their legendary, unclassifiable sound. The public was fascinated by this strange, hybrid act that could make you weep 1 minute and laugh the next. But inside the studio, the war raged. Cliff, the proud poet, felt he was compromising his soul, selling out the deep blues artistry he had bled for in the mines. He was being forced to play the clown to his brother's ringmaster. And there was another secret element that added a terrifying layer of desperation to Cliff's fight: his arthritis. The ticking time bomb in his hands was getting louder. The pain was no longer just a ghost, it was a constant growing presence. He was now in a race, not just against his brother and the label, but against his own body. He was in his late 30s, and he could feel his primary tool, his hands, beginning to fail him. This added a new frantic urgency to his serious ambition. He had to get his real music recorded now, before his hands gave out completely. He had to create a legacy of mastery that could not be erased. This made him more stubborn, more difficult in the studio. He fought tooth and nail for every one of his serious songs, seeing each one as a potential last stand. To Bill and to the Decca executives, this just looked like artistic snobbery, a stubborn refusal to play the game and record the hits. They couldn't understand that Cliff was fighting for his artistic life. This war in the wax, this battle between the poet and the jester, continued for nearly a decade. Bill was winning most of the commercial skirmishes. With the label's backing, Cliff was winning the long-term war for artistry, recording a body of serious work that would much later be recognized as genius. They were trapped together, bound by blood, by contracts, and by their shared desperate fear of poverty. The tension was becoming unbearable, and then, in a single unexpected moment, the entire world shifted. The war ended. America in 1946 was a nation desperate to forget the past and dance. The frantic, escapist energy that had been brewing during the war years was now exploding into new forms of music. The soldiers were home, the jukeboxes were loud, and the public's musical palette was changing with revolutionary speed. The high, lonesome yodel and the somber 1930s-style steel guitar ballads that had been Cliff Carlisle's signature were suddenly no longer just serious. They were old. They were the sound of the Depression, the music of a world that was now gone. A new, faster, and louder sound was emerging, the electric, percussive, boogie-woogie beat that would soon evolve into rockabilly. And this new world was not built for the poet, Cliff. It was tailor-made for the jester, Bill. This was the real tragic turning point of their career. It was not a single dramatic fight. It was Cliff's slow, quiet, and undeniable obsolescence. While Cliff, the master, saw his serious artistry fall out of public favor, he watched as his brother's fun, the frantic guitar, the comedic timing, the crowd-pleasing showmanship, became the exact thing the new post-war audience craved. The label executives, driven by jukebox sales, saw this trend clearly. They didn't want the slow, sad songs of the past. They wanted the boogie of the future. Bill, the ultimate showman, was more than happy to provide it. For Cliff, this was the final devastating betrayal. It was not a betrayal by his brother, but by time itself. The world had simply and mercilessly moved on. His serious art was no longer real work. It was a commercial liability. This shift created the real bitter end. Cliff's recording career, which had been slowing for years, effectively came to a complete halt around 1947. He was not a king. He was not the man with a million seller. He was a master craftsman whose craft was no longer in demand. His body, too, was beginning its final crippling assault. The arthritis, that ghost from the coal mine, was making the mastery of the steel guitar an agonizing chore. His serious art was being silenced, both by the public and by his own body. He was, in every sense of the word, broken. It was in this vacuum, with Cliff's career effectively over due to obsolescence and illness, that Bill Carlisle made his move. He was no longer just a jester in his brother's shadow. He was an ambitious commercial powerhouse whose time had finally come. He didn't need to counterattack his brother. He simply had to step over his brother's abandoned throne. He began a quiet, calculated rebellion, building his own brand. He started forming strategic alliances with the other comedy acts at the Opry, men like Grandpa Jones. These were his people, the ones who, like him, understood the value of a laugh. The first public shot, the act of open independence that proved the duo was terminally broken, came around 1952. Bill, now fully entrenched in his comedy alliance at the Opry, saw his opportunity. His friends, the popular wickedly funny duo Homer and Jethro, had a new novelty song. It was a parody of Too Old to Cut the Mustard, a cheeky tune about an older man trying to keep up. It was pure Bill Carlisle. A fun song. Through and through, Bill made a decision that was strategically brilliant. He did not bring the song to Cliff. He did not need to. He went into the studio and recorded it as a featured vocalist with Homer and Jethro. This was a public declaration of independence. It was Bill, in front of the entire music industry, announcing that he was a solo act, a star in his own right, and that his fun brand did not need his brother's serious approval. The song was a popular success. The validation for Bill was absolute and overwhelming. He had proven his point. He had proven that comedy sold. He had proven that he was the commercial powerhouse. And he had proven, most painfully of all, that he could do it without Cliff, who was by now a non-entity in the recording world. The internal dynamic of the duo was now shattered. Bill was no longer the insecure Jester. He was the proven hitmaker. He had the label's ear. He had the Opry crowd. Cliff, his hands aching with arthritis and his heart aching with resentment, was now the one in the weaker position. The war was all but over. All that was left was for Bill to deliver the final killing blow, not to his brother, but to his brother's memory. The killing blow came just 1 year later in 1953. Bill, now completely vindicated and overflowing with commercial confidence, brought a new song to his new group, the Carlisles, a group that pointedly did not include Cliff. The song was called No Help Wanted. It was the antithesis of Cliff's music in every conceivable way. It was not a somber ballad. It was a frantic, almost unhinged novelty song, driven by a pounding, propulsive bass line and Bill's breathless, fast-talking comedic vocal. It was the Jester's philosophy perfected. The lyrics were a chaotic, rapid-fire boast from a man so confident in his romantic prowess that he posts a "No Help Wanted" sign on his lover's door. It was silly. It was ridiculous. It was a 3-minute explosion of pure, uncut fun. This was not a song Cliff was forced to play on in a final humiliation. This was a song that was a hit because he was absent. The poet, the master of the blues, was not even in the room. His frivolity had been completely exorcised. And the Jester was free. And the song, of course, was an absolute monster. No Help Wanted was not just a hit. It was an explosion. It was the right song for the right time. America, now deep in the prosperous, optimistic post-war 1950s boom, was tired of post-war melancholy. They wanted to laugh. They wanted to dance. They wanted knotholes and mustard. No Help Wanted shot to #1 on the country charts, and in the ultimate vindication for Bill, it crossed over, becoming a massive hit on the pop charts as well. This was it. The Jester had checkmated the poet. Bill was completely 100% vindicated. His fun philosophy had landed a #1 pop crossover hit, a feat Cliff's serious art had never achieved. The war was over. Bill had won. The dynamic within the Carlisle brothers was now impossible. It had been over for years. Bill was the new king, the undisputed commercial powerhouse. He had proven his point, and he was ready to reap the rewards. He was already planning his solo career, the hotshot Elmer persona he had been building at the Opry, and he no longer wanted to be held back by his difficult, artsy has-been brother, and Cliff was now the ultimate difficult partner. He was bitter, he was angry, and he was in constant agonizing pain. The arthritis, That dark ghost from the 1911 coal mine had launched its final crippling assault. The disease had rendered his hands almost useless for the demanding virtuosic steel guitar work that had been his signature. His serious art had been silenced, not just by the public and his brother, but by his own body. He was, in every sense of the word, broken. This was the perfect, tragic convergence. Bill's commercial triumph happened at the exact same moment as Cliff's complete physical collapse. This is what makes the 1947 to 1954 period so tragic. It was not a split, it was an eclipse. Bill didn't just win, his opponent was medically disqualified from the fight as the public's taste changed. There was no farewell tour. There was no final tearful performance at the Grand Ole Opry. After nearly 2 decades of groundbreaking music, the most influential harmony act of their time just stopped. The silence was deafening. The poet and the jester, after a 50-year-long struggle that began in a Kentucky cabin, had finally violently gone their separate ways. The war was over. Bill Carlisle, triumphant, ambitious, and finally free, stood alone in the bright, demanding spotlight of the Grand Ole Opry, ready to launch his solo comedy empire. And Clifford Carlisle, defeated, bitter, and broken by his own body, packed his steel guitar into its case for the last time. He was not just leaving the duo, he was being erased. He turned his back on Nashville and began the long, quiet, painful journey home to Kentucky into an exile of obscurity from which he would never return. For Cliff Carlisle, the solo world was not a new beginning. It was an immediate and brutal humiliation. After his recording career ended in 1947, he tried to cut a few more sides in the 50s to show the world the real Cliff Carlisle, the undiluted master, the poet who had been held back by his brother's commercial frivolity. But the world, it turned out, was not just indifferent, it was hostile. The year was 1955. A cultural hurricane named Elvis Presley was tearing down the very foundations of the music industry. The raw, sexual, and rhythm-driven sound of rockabilly was exploding. The world didn't want the high, lonesome Yodel of the past. It wanted the raw, unhinged energy of Heartbreak Hotel. Cliff's sound, once revolutionary in its blending of blues and country, now seemed ancient. His complex, mournful steel guitar ballads were seen as relics from a bygone era. The music of their parents, the very sound the new generation was rebelling against his solo recordings, artistically pure as they were, landed with a dull, sickening thud. They were catastrophic commercial failures. The industry he had helped to build had now completely and mercilessly moved on. This professional rejection was devastating, but it was nothing compared to the second, more intimate and more final betrayal. The betrayal of his own body. The arthritis, the curse born in the damp, dark coal mine of his childhood, the disease he had hidden for so long, now accelerated its attack with a terrifying vengeance. The ghost of that 8-year-old boy, forced into a real job to ensure his family's survival, had returned to claim its final crippling payment. His hands, the very instruments of his genius, became his prison. The pain was no longer a secret he could hide with grit and willpower. It was a constant, debilitating, white-hot reality. Playing the steel guitar, the act that had defined his entire identity, became a daily exercise in exquisite torture. His master's hands, the hands that could make a guitar weep and wail with unparalleled soul, were now gnarled, swollen, and increasingly useless. The psychological torment of this was immense. The one thing that separated him from his father's fate, the one thing that proved his real job of music was a success, was being physically stolen from him, joint by joint. He was becoming the very thing he had always feared, a broken-down laborer, his body destroyed by his work, unable to tour, unable to play to his own exacting standards of mastery, and completely abandoned by the changing tides of popular music. Cliff Carlisle did the unthinkable. He surrendered. The master, the poet, the man who had built his life on serious ambition, retired. It was not a graceful exit, not a farewell tour celebrated by adoring fans. It was a bitter, silent, and deeply resentful retreat. He packed his bags, left the humiliation of Nashville behind, and returned to the relative obscurity of Kentucky, the very place he had fought his entire life to escape. He settled into a life of profound, almost monastic isolation. He was a man in his 50s, living in a forced early retirement, a ghost haunting his own life. The tragedy was not just the pain or the silence. The true daily torture was the radio. In his quiet Kentucky home, Cliff was a prisoner, forced to listen as the music world spun on without him. He heard the slick, polished Nashville sound of the 60s, a sound that had no room for his raw blues. He heard the countrypolitan crossover hits of the 70s. And worst of all, every Saturday night the radio would bring the sound of his brother's roaring, unmitigated success into his silent room. He had to listen to the thunderous applause for the very frivolity he had despised, the silly songs, the hotshot Elmer persona. It was the ultimate final humiliation. For Bill Carlisle, the breakup was not an ending. It was a coronation. He didn't miss a single beat. While Cliff retreated into the shadows of Kentucky, Bill exploded into the spotlight of Nashville, freed from the artistic anchor of his brother's seriousness. He was finally able to unleash the full, unadulterated force of his fun ambition. He didn't just stay at the Grand Ole Opry, he conquered it. He became its court jester, and in doing so became one of its most powerful and enduring kings. To do this, he created a persona, a stage alter ego that would become one of the most beloved and bizarre spectacles in country music history. He was no longer just Bill Carlisle, the harmony partner. He was hotshot Elmer. This character was a masterpiece of comedic branding, the physical manifestation of the 8-year-old kid from Kentucky who had learned that the only way to get attention in a crowded, impoverished house was to be the loudest, funniest, and most disruptive person in the room. Now that room was the Ryman Auditorium, and the audience was the entire nation. Hotshot Elmer was a sight to behold. Bill would burst onto the stage in a suit of impossible gaudiness, a visual assault of clashing colors, polka dots, and stripes. He famously wore mismatched shoes, sometimes one red, one yellow, claiming with a straight face that it helped his balance. His true signature, however, was the leap. He would punctuate his songs by jumping impossibly high in the air, a manic jumping jack of pure caffeinated energy, all while playing his guitar at a frantic, percussive pace. He was ridiculous, he was absurd, and he was completely, utterly magnetic. This persona was more than just a costume. It was a profound psychological liberation. It was Bill's final, definitive, and triumphant rejection of the serious blues that his brother had championed and that he had always secretly envied. He was, in effect, telling the world, "You think I'm not a serious artist? You're right. I'm a joke, and I'm the most successful joke in this town." He had taken his greatest insecurity, that he was just the funny guy, and turned it into his greatest weapon. He had weaponized frivolity, and it worked. It worked beyond his wildest dreams. The Opry audience, a multi-generational crowd looking for entertainment and escape on a Saturday night, adored him. They didn't always want to be challenged by the poet's dark blues. They wanted to be entertained by the Jester's simple, joyful antics. Bill became the Opry's essential palate cleanser, the man who could follow a heart-wrenching ballad from Hank Snow with a burst of pure, silly sunshine, and the crowd would roar its approval. While Cliff was struggling to sell a few hundred copies of his somber solo records, Bill was racking up new solo hits. The momentum from his 1953 No Help Wanted smash had given him the platform, and he seized it. In 1955, as a full-time solo act, he released his defining anthem, Knothole. This was the song he was born to sing. It was a silly, fast-paced novelty song about a man peeking through a knothole in a wooden fence, complete with a catchy, repetitive yodel as its hook. It was pure Bill Carlisle, and it was a massive top 10 hit. He followed it with other comedy hits and a string of successful albums in the 1960s. He became not just a performer at the Opry, but an institution. He was the living, breathing embodiment of its show business side, a reliable, beloved, and constant presence for 50 years. He had done it. He had achieved the financial security he and Cliff had dreamed of in the mines. He had achieved the fame he had craved his entire life. He had won. He had won the war, he had won the audience, and he had won the rest of his life. The solo careers of the Carlisle brothers represent one of the most profound and cruel ironies in the annals of music history. The central conflict of their lives, serious versus fun, poet versus jester, had finally and definitively been settled by the public, and the verdict was a brutal, overwhelming, and unappealable victory for fun. The long-term implications of this verdict created two parallel lives, one a quiet hell, the other a haunted paradise. Cliff, the poet, was the true pioneer. He was the one who had blended the black blues with the white yodel before it was fashionable. He was the undisputed master of the steel guitar, a virtuoso who had influenced countless future musicians. And he was now, in 1965, a nobody. He was erased from the story, a historical footnote, a whatever happened to trivia question. Bill, the jester, was the man with the silly songs. He was the man who had, in Cliff's eyes, sacrificed artistic depth for cheap commercial appeal. He was the man who dressed in mismatched shoes, leaped in the air, and sang about peeking through knotholes. And he was an immortal. He was a living legend, celebrated weekly on the most sacred stage in country music. His name synonymous with the Grand Ole Opry itself. The world, it turned out, didn't want the complex, somber, and physically broken artist. It wanted the leaping, laughing, and relentlessly energetic comedian. The physical irony only twisted the knife. Cliff's body, broken by the real job of the mine, had destroyed his art. Bill's body, also damaged by the real job of the farm, was a mere annoyance. His chronic back pain was real, but he turned it into a part of the act. His manic leap, a defiant rejection of the pain, a symbol of his unstoppable energy. Bill's longevity, his sheer physical endurance to perform for 50 more years, became his final unanswerable weapon in their lifelong war. He didn't just win, he outlived the fight. This was Cliff's hell. He was forced to live out his days in a prison of obscurity, his body a cage of constant pain. His hands, resting on his lap, were a useless, mocking reminder of the mastery he had lost. And every Saturday night, the radio would bring the sound of his brother's triumph into his silent room. He had to listen to the roaring applause for the very frivolity he had despised, the very sound that had, in his mind, diluted their true serious legacy. It was the ultimate final humiliation. The jester was dancing, and the crowd was paying for the privilege. But the story is not that simple. It is never that simple. The poet was in a physical hell, but the jester was living in a complex psychological one. Bill Carlisle had everything. He had wealth, he had fame, he had a stable, loving family, he had a 50-year contract that guaranteed him a place at the Opry until the day he died. He had his health, his energy, his longevity. He had won. He had won everything they had ever set out to get. But the victory was hollow. It was cold, and it came with a secret, crushing, and non-negotiable weight. Bill was haunted. He was haunted every single day by the ghost of his brother. He was living with a profound, unspoken, and deeply buried case of survivor's guilt. He knew better than anyone, in the place deep behind the hotshot Elmer mask, that Cliff was the true genius of the family. He knew that his own comedy, his fun, had been the commercial engine, but that Cliff's serious blues was their artistic soul. He felt on some level that he had stolen the Carlisle legacy. He was the face of the name, but he wasn't its heart. His fame felt fraudulent, his success cheapened by the knowledge that the real artist was sitting, broken and forgotten, in Kentucky. He hadn't beaten Cliff in a fair fight for the public's affection. He had simply outlasted him. He had won by default because his brother's body, ravaged by the mine, had been medically disqualified from the fight. This was not a satisfying victory for a competitor like Bill. This secret guilt defined the rest of his life. His manic, energetic performance became more than just an act. It was a distraction. It was a defense mechanism. It was a way to keep moving, to keep laughing, to keep the applause coming so that he would never have a quiet moment to stop and think about the man in the dark, the man whose career he had effectively, if not intentionally, helped to destroy. He was a jester forced to laugh, not just for the crowd, but for himself, to drown out the high, lonesome wail of his brother's ghost. His lifelong jealousy of Cliff's serious talent had now in his old age metastasized into a complex, mournful grief. He had the fame he always wanted, but he had lost the one person, his older brother, whose respect he had craved his entire life. He was the most beloved man at the Grand Ole Opry, a king in his own right, but he was also, in his own way, completely and utterly alone, the last man standing on a battlefield of his own making. And so for nearly 30 long silent years, these two parallel universes continued. Cliff, the forgotten poet, lived in a world of silence, physical pain, and bitter obscurity. Bill, the celebrated jester, lived in a world of bright lights, roaring laughter, and profound secret regret. The stage was set for the final act. He died, as he had lived for the past quarter century, in the shadows. On April 5th, 1983, Clifford Carlisle passed away in Lexington, Kentucky, after a long, debilitating illness. He was 79 years old. It was not a major news event. The music world, obsessed with the new generation of stars, like Alabama and George Strait, barely registered his passing. The obituaries were small, local affairs, respectful but brief. Many of them, in a final stinging and predictable indignity, identified him first and foremost as the brother of Opry star Bill Carlisle. The poet, the master, the innovator, had died as a footnote to his own story. The silence was now absolute. For Bill Carlisle, his brother's death was not a release. It was the closing of a door, the final irreversible turning of a key. The war was over. His great rival, his artistic conscience, his lifelong shadow was gone. For nearly 30 years, he had lived with the active guilt of his own success versus his brother's failure. Now he was left with something far heavier, far more permanent, the crushing, solitary weight of the survivor. He was no longer just the jester. He was the keeper of the flame, the sole remaining guardian of the entire Carlisle legacy. This knowledge changed everything. His manic, energetic performance, which he continued with relentless vigor, well into his 70s and 80s, was no longer just an act of ambition. It was an act of desperation. It was a frantic dance against time, a way to keep moving, to keep laughing, so he wouldn't have to stop and think about the man who was now permanently silent. To stop laughing would be to finally break down and acknowledge the gaping hole, the profound complex grief. His hotshot Elmer persona, the very thing that had brought him fame, was now his own gilded cage, just as Cliff's arthritic body had been his. He was trapped in the fun identity, a prisoner of the success he had always craved. He became the beloved grandfather of the Opry, a living institution. But behind the curtain, the regret was palpable. Bill was haunted by the secret he had always known, that Cliff was the true genius, and that the world had celebrated the wrong brother. He felt on some level that he had won a fixed fight, a fight where his opponent had been crippled before the final bell. His entire solo career now felt like a long, hollow victory, a prize he hadn't fully earned. This secret guilt fueled a new, quiet, private mission. It was no longer about Bill Carlisle's fame. It was about preserving the Carlisle name. He began to talk more in interviews, steering the conversation away from his knothole persona and back to their early days. He spoke of Cliff's mastery of the steel guitar, of their influences, of the serious blues they had played. He, the survivor, now had to do the historical work for both of them. He had to be the jester and the poet's historian. He had to ensure that the man who died in obscurity would not be erased from the history books. He was no longer just protecting his own fame. He was protecting his brother's memory. For decades, the official history of country music had largely mirrored the public's verdict. Bill was remembered as the Opry legend. Cliff was a footnote, a name known only to hardcore collectors and music historians. But as the 20th century closed, a new generation of critics, scholars, and reissue labels began to look past the bright, shiny veneer of the 1950s. They started digging. They were looking for the roots, for the old, weird America, for the authentic sources of the music they loved. They didn't just listen to Knothole or Too Old to Cut the Mustard. They found the original, crackling 1930s Decca and ARC recordings. They heard the war firsthand. They heard Cliff's revolutionary, blues-drenched steel guitar. They heard his high, lonesome yodel, a sound that predated and influenced almost everyone who followed. They unearthed the buried secret that Cliff's white yodel was deeply influenced by the black influence of the blues musicians he had known in the mines, a racial taboo he had masked, but which was the very source of his serious artistry. The critics, half a century late, finally understood. They realized that without the Carlisle brothers, without Cliff's artistry and Bill's energy, the bridge from Jimmie Rodgers to the bluegrass of the Monroe brothers was incomplete. The poet's work, it turned out, was the foundational text. The reissues of their 1930s and 1940s material in the 1990s and 2000s sparked a massive revival of interest among music purists. The internet allowed historians to share the obscure, serious side of their catalog. This critical reevaluation culminated in 2002. The call came. It was the ultimate late restoration. The Country Music Hall of Fame announced its new class of inductees. The name read was not the Carlisle brothers. The name, in a final, brutal, and perfect irony, was Bill Carlisle. This was the climax of their entire 80-year story. This was the moment of final, absolute vindication. Not for Cliff, but for Bill. Imagine that moment. Bill Carlisle, 93 years old, frail in a wheelchair, just months from his own death, is wheeled into that glittering ceremony. This is not an act of redemption. It is not atonement. He is not accepting an award for the serious work he had once envied. He is accepting an award as a solo act for his 50 years at the Opry, for Hotshot Elmer, for No Help Wanted, and for Knothole. He is being immortalized for the fun. The Jester, in his final performance, is crowned king, and the poet, the master, the true pioneer, is left outside the gates, erased by the very institution meant to protect his memory. It was the final, unappealable verdict. The serious work, the blues, the art, it was important, but the comedy, it turned out, was what got you immortalized. Bill Carlisle's life's work was now complete. He had secured the fame. He had outlived the fight. There was nothing left to do. The Jester's long, exhausting performance was over. 5 months later, on March 17, 2003, Bill Carlisle died of heart failure. He was 94 years old. He had outlived his brother by almost exactly 20 years. He died a beloved, universally adored icon, a man who had brought joy to millions. The poet and the jester, the two warring sides of the Kentucky coin, were finally, permanently silent. So how do we remember the legacy of the Carlisle brothers? It is the ultimate bi-tragedy of sibling harmony. Their hits, No Help Wanted and Knothole, are the symbols of the Jester's final victory. They were pioneers who blended blues, yodel, and comedy. But their story is a brutal cautionary tale about the price of ambition, a story of two men scarred by the same Kentucky poverty cliff. The eldest reacted by pursuing artistic perfection, a seriousness he believed would protect him. But the tragic irony is that the very childhood labor that fueled his serious blues also created the disease that destroyed his hands, his career, and his legacy, leaving him to die in obscurity. Bill, the youngest, reacted by pursuing fame, a fun identity he believed would protect him. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, becoming a Hall of Fame legend. But the tragic irony is that he paid for it with a lifetime of guilt, forever haunted by the knowledge that his fame was built on the ashes of his brother's genius, that the world had celebrated the wrong man. Cliff was the poet, the one who died forgotten. Bill was the jester, the one who lived to be remembered. In the end, their true legacy is not one or the other. It is not the blues or the comedy. Their true legacy is the tension between them. Their greatest, most revolutionary music exists only in that small, violent, and sacred space where the poet and the jester, the serious and the fun, were forced to share a single microphone. It is the sound of a war disguised beautifully as a perfect harmony